Hello, everyone, and welcome back to First Peoples Cultural Council's 2025 online learning series hosted by the Arts Program, Our Stories, Our Voices. FPCC supports language, culture, heritage, and arts revitalization for BC First Nations and is located in the Wasanich Nation in the village of Wajahlet. We also have offices in Kamloops to Secwepemc. I am joining from further north in Secwepemc from what's known as Williams Lake. My name is Cindy Charlie Boy, and I'll be your host today. I am Chilcotin and Secwepemc and work with FPCC's arts team. I welcome you all here and ask that you feel free to share in the chat where you're joining from. Today, we are so happy and grateful to welcome renowned artist and arts, language, and culture advocate, Luann Neal from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. Luann will explore the TRC's calls to action and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how both can be implemented into everyday practice for artists and arts administrators. Welcome, Luann.
Leila Kasla. Leila Kastachla. Ikat Wagatlin. Gayutlin Laka Mama Lila Klatlu Aquagil. La Amcha and Hakila Kastlaka La Quangan. La Ehishkala Gachens Hanskachela Koch Awitnagwisas. So, in my language of Kwakwala, and thanks to my mom, who is a fluent speaker, I've introduced myself by one of the four names that I carry, which is Ikatwaga, and just explained that I'm from the Mamalilakla and the Kwagil people, but I'm also from the Danakdauch, Mamtagila, Kwikwasutinoch, and Numgays people. And I also thanked and acknowledged the people of the Lekwungen for always making me feel so welcome in the lands of their ancestors. So thanks so much for the introduction, Cindy. Um, I'll be ready for the slides in just a moment, but I just want to say welcome to everybody who's joined online today. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy days. And I also want to thank First Peoples for inviting me to be part of this year's series. I've been really anxious to share some of this material, and I'll just tell you right now, we've only got an hour. So I'm going to share as much as I can in that hour, and I hope that in the half hour that follows my presentation, you'll feel free to ask some questions. Okay, so out of the UN Declaration, the four that I selected were Article 11, which speaks to the right to practice, revitalize cultural traditions and customs. Article 13, which speaks to the right to revitalize, use, develop, transmit histories and language. Article 15, which speaks to the right to the dignity and diversity of cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations. And finally, Article 16, which speaks to the right Indigenous people have to create media in our own languages. So what I wanted to just point out here is that with the UN Declaration, the federal government and the province have also done another layer of legislation, which is called the the words just escape. Enabling. They are enabling legislation, and it enables the departments that are responsible to carry out the work. So in BC, the DRIPA, I love these unfortunate acronyms. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act was an act that was passed in, I believe it was 2019, and that enabled BC to carry on and make actual plans. So there's several different layers that these big, larger sort of national declarations and the TRC calls to action, they have to go through several layers before they land right in the place where we can actually make some change. Okay, next slide. So I'm just going to go through these, and I've paired them up a little bit so that I can talk about a TRC call to action and an UNDRIP article at the same time. And because there's so much that interweaves together, it was really difficult to only find four of each of these and get straight to some good points that work for all of us. So in this instance, the TRC number 14, which talks about the Indigenous Languages Act, and then UNDRIP, which talks about the Indigenous peoples' right to have, or the Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs, including, and this is actually listed in UNDRIP, archaeological and historic sites, artifacts, ceremonies, technologies, old and new, and then visual arts, performing arts, music, and literature. And I just wanted to add a little proviso here that all of these, when I talk about the arts, I'm not just talking about visual arts. The arts in my practice has always been visual arts, which is everything from carving, painting, weaving, drum making, everything you can think of. So there's visual arts, there's dance, music, theater, storytelling and writing, performing arts, and media. So arts has always seemed to be used to just talk about paintings and carvings. But when I talk about the arts, I'm talking about all of those different genres of art. So in this instance with the call for action 14, the languages are actually the foundation upon which all of those art forms are practiced. They come from our language. We have a story, a legend or a history, an encounter with supernatural beings, for example. Those are the kinds of things that create any one of those forms of art. And so it's really important that the languages not only are revitalized, but that they become incorporated into every one of those art forms. So we have to, I think, more closely bring those things together. We're seeing it a lot with stories already. I see books being written in our language. I see plays being told, music and songs being made. So we just have to keep doing those things, and that whole idea of separating every single art form into a different category. Our arts are inherently interdisciplinary, and I think I've talked with many of you about this when we've had a chance to visit and talk about it, and we just have to keep bringing that back and re-emphasizing that to the funding programs that support these kinds of things. um, the next thing I want to say about this is that what artists can do is continue to balance the language revitalization project. So a great example is through First Peoples. There's a lot of projects and programs that are going that use that revitalize the languages. But as part of revitalizing, I've actually seen people doing activities such as in our territory, you're making button blankets, you're making regalia, cedar bark weaving, spruce root harvesting, all of those kinds of things, making sure that when you're doing the practice of harvesting or the practice of making, that you're using the language. So that's just emphasizing what I was saying there before. Um, and then the other thing is with the Aboriginal Languages Act, now that there's legislation, I think that what needs to happen is the next layer of legislation is usually a thing called regulations. The act is put into motion and implemented through regulations. And one of the regulations I really think we need to talk about is the use of our languages. We're seeing many people claiming our words, our phrases, our place names, and even names of things like an eagle, and then naming their children using our words from our languages. Uh, and that troubles a lot of people, troubles me, because that's how our language starts to get lost. I think we have to spend time making sure we understand the permissions around language use and the proper use of them. Um, and then we can talk later after we're a lot stronger in holding our languages as to whether other people, it's okay for other people to use our languages, people who aren't from our cultures. So we need to talk about that a little bit more. And I think that that's something that can happen as part of the Indigenous Languages Act and the Office of the Indigenous Language Commissioner, I believe is the title. The last thing to say about this part is that in using our languages, we start to understand some of the early beginnings and the context of sovereignty and of nationhood. The way our languages describe these things and connect us as individuals, not only to our immediate family, extended family, village, and our nation, but also to our places. They're all interwoven. So the way we understand our languages and the way we put these things into practice is to always look at when we're developing programs. So artists, if you have an arts administrator, say from Canada Council, BC Arts Council, or First Peoples, asking you about how a program could be improved, that's where I think our languages can be used to help just redirect things so that they're really supporting our communities the way we need to be supported. So programs and projects, and I differentiate between a program and a project in that a program is a longer term, offered year to year, usually an application-based thing, sometimes for individuals, sometimes for groups, but a project can actually be something developed by a community and they apply to a program to help fund a short-term project. That could be up to a year. So I just keep that in mind as I go through. The other thing our languages, I think, are very important in shaping are the policies and processes. Right now, there are real standards that have been maintained. They're not formal standards either. They're just in practice, funding agencies, government departments develop policies and processes that what I've seen in the course of my 40 years is a lot of copying and pasting and borrowing from existing programs. That's, I think, part of our problem in finding programs that work and policies that work. This is where our languages can help to really clearly define ultimately what our goals are. So using our languages, um, actually using words from our language in policy is a possibility. So we need to talk about that some more. And making sure that our people are involved in the committees or the working groups or the task forces that are involved in changing things like programs, projects, policies, and processes. So we need to be at the table. We need to bring that wisdom with us. And then on the arts administrator side, that whether it's an Indigenous organization or a non-Indigenous or government organization, there has to be the open ears for all that great wisdom that's being brought to the table. So there's a little bit of balance, and maybe there's some other activities that can be done to just make that a much more comfortable space to do that kind of sharing. Next slide. feel like I'm talking really fast. Okay, my favorite topic, Canadian Copyright Act. So right now, under Article 11, it talks about the protection of these rights. So I've zoomed in on the Canadian Copyright Act because it's, in theory, it's meant to apply to all Canadian artists. In practice, it does not currently align with the unique arts, cultures, or languages of each respective First Nation in this country. So there's a real disconnect. It's aspirational. It's supposed to cover everything, but in practice, I've actually tried to walk through the process, and it's very difficult and very expensive in the end. One thing I'll say here, because I always need to say it, is this copyright symbol that we have available. Um, People really do need to make use of that. Under the Copyright Act, you don't have to register and pay for a registration of your artwork. The Act actually says the moment you put the copyright symbol on your work, it's copyrighted. Even if you didn't, it's still your work, it's copyrighted. But don't take any chances. Always sign your work, and that's whether it's a painting, carving, etc., music. You have to write down your music anyway. You have to write down poetry. Anything that you create in any art form, make sure that attached to it is your name, the date you created it, the year you created it, your signature, an artist biography, and then an artist statement about the work. So that's a really nice full package, and I'll share a little bit more as we go along about why that's going to be important, on the matter of the artist resale right. So currently, the Copyright Act doesn't specifically offer us protection. And I think that what I've seen, and in all the discussions I've had with government folks about this, is they don't know. There's too many nations across this country for any one government department to know how to protect any one particular culture of art. That's up to us. And I think this is where we have to start getting a lot more organized in the way we do these things and think about these things, and not wait for these government departments, even though they have a mandate, even though they have usually some pretty clear direction. When the feet hit the ground, they don't always know. So, and it's kind of an impossible task to ask a department, whether they're federal or provincial, to talk about all the First Nations and what's different about each of their unique copyrights. So we have to spend some time on that ourselves. If we don't spend time on it, we're going to continue to see what we're seeing, which is the appropriation, another word for theft, of our artworks from our artists. I've had this happen to me, and and there's not a lot we can do about it. Again, it's expensive to hire a lawyer, and you usually wouldn't get back a settlement that would make up for the losses of having your artwork stolen. So, obviously, lots of other things to think about. So, as I mentioned, making use of the copyright symbol, making sure that the date or the year is present, making sure that you create an artist statement, and there are samples that we'll be able to share after this webinar. Um, and then communities also, how do each of us communicate um, our permissions? This is a really big area, protocols and permissions to use a story or a history or a supernatural legend from our people. There is no system in the Western Copyright Act or the Western systems to give permission for a legend that comes from your family, for example. We have to do that. So we have a lot of work to do in that respect. There's a lot of demands, and we're actually seeing people just taking our stories, doing an adaptation or the inspired by version of our stories. Everything's sitting wide open right now. And it's really going to be up to our communities to start putting some boundaries around that, some parameters, and figuring out what's our legal equivalent, what's our traditional laws and contemporary laws that can come together in the middle and serve the purpose of protecting that which is ours. So lots to work to do there. From an arts administrator perspective, I think that what can happen if you're an arts administrator, think about this. Reviewing existing policies, programs, your program guidelines, the processes that you use to do whatever it is you do, whether it's allowing grants or funding different programs and projects, and really taking a look at the systemic or attitudinal barriers. And I know that it sounds really simple, and then you look at something and you go, okay, what am I looking for? Um, one of the best ways I've found for administrators is to run a few scenarios, run a few project scenarios to see if the wording in your guidelines actually um, is nice and openly worded so that it receives the information you need to make a decision, or is it asking for things that maybe not every artist has access to? And the example I always use is lots of applications will say, send us a link to your Vimeo reel if you're applying for a film project. Well, does everyone have a computer? Does everyone have access to high-speed internet? Do people know how to make a Vimeo or any kind of a reel? Does it cost money to do that in the first place? So, it starts to cascade really quickly into we've just created a barrier to this new emerging filmmaker applying for funding because they don't even have access to the tools to make this quick little video. So it's examples like that I ask arts administrators especially to look at that and see what's happening with your wording, and does it just inadvertently create a barrier? And there's lots of discussions we can have across organizations about that. So one thing I wanted to say here before I move on from copyright is copyright and intellectual properties are, uh, I guess, two sides of one coin. And intellectual properties is a much broader understanding of things like I've mentioned, like with traditional legends, a legend about a supernatural being, and that supernatural being might be one of your origin stories, or an ancestor, a supernatural ancestor that bestows rights on your families. Intellectual properties, everything about that legend, the story itself, which is in the language, the translation of it, if you translate it to English or French, and then how you make a book, a song, a dance, a theater performance, an animation. How you make all of that is comes from the intellectual property rights of someone, a family, a nation, for anyone from an individual through a nation. So intellectual properties aren't just creations of the mind in our world, they're creations of minds before us that became rights that we inherited. So there's real property ownership there, if you want to use those terms, but there's also cultural and language rights there as well. So that's a whole other discussion that I think needs to be opened up and understood for more than the way people are understanding it right now. Um, it's also really important in the part that talks about the TRC talking about education and public awareness, is a lot of this work around copyright, intellectual properties, setting up our own curriculums and our own systems, all help to reverse some of the stereotypes and the misunderstandings people have about First Nations people. So I think that has to be it's not enough to say, thou shalt not be racist. We have to actually remove some of the stereotypes that have been placed there very deliberately. And that also becomes a part of our copyright and our intellectual property realm. Okay, next slide. So in practice, what I'm suggesting is that one of the ways, or some of the ways, that we can address these many different issues is to continue developing our own organizations with our own mandates and policies, our traditional systems of law and governance. They flow from our traditional system. This is big work. I'm doing this right now with a community-based nonprofit. It's exciting to think about. When I look at the registrar of companies, when you set up a not-for-profit society, they give you a bunch of bylaws. You can just adapt them. But if you read those bylaws, there's a lot of loopholes in there. And in our systems, we don't have, I think we have exceptions to rules, but not blatant loopholes. So when we're looking at our traditional ways of doing things, of belonging, which is the same as membership, and the rules of being part of the society, how much you give, what you get back. We need to start doing a great deal more of that, paralleling the bylaws into our own traditional systems, because these nonprofits operate in our communities and they have to make sense for our people. And the only way that our arts, language, culture, histories, and education are going to make sense in our communities if our own nonprofits are spelled out in a way that corresponds with our traditions. So we need to also think about writing our own declarations or manifestos. I love those. They're a great exercise. It's kind of a fun workshop to do. That really gets us talking about how we assert our rights and how we establish clear boundaries. If we don't write them, someone else is going to write them for us. And that's what's been happening so far. So we definitely need to spend time in community doing that kind of work. And then, of course, making use of the copyright symbol every chance we get with your artist statement and your artist biography. Do I have another note about that? Oh, the last thing I want to say in the whole copyright world is the Copyright Act is there. It's a piece of legislation, and the way you change legislation like that, and the example I always share for a copyright is you can either amend the current Copyright Act and you can have an addendum to it so that all of our rights form a part of the actual act itself. So every single nation could have an addendum to the Copyright Act, or we could, all of us or some of us, say we want an exemption from the Copyright Act. It's not serving our purpose. Our nation will decide how these things will operate and how we access and share or not share our intellectual property. So we want an exemption. We don't want the Copyright Act to apply to us. We're not even going to use the copyright symbol. We're going to create our own reality around this. So those are two really big options, and but we need discussion, and we need our artists to be part of that discussion, and we need arts administrators to be part of that discussion, as well as the knowledge keepers in our communities who speak our language, because either option requires us to be really clear about what's okay and what's not okay. I see I'm running out of time. Okay, carry on to the next slide, please, and I won't chat so much off the cuff here. All right, so call to action 63.III.3 and Article 13. These are pieces that talk about building student capacity, supporting education, but also talking about how our histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, and writing systems, all of these are 100% controlled and developed by us. So what I really wanted to say here are two things. First, small list is that it's not okay for anyone outside of our culture to tell our histories, even if they've heard or witnessed these histories being told. This does not give them the right to co-opt it or retell it or remount it or present it without our permission. That's what this statement in UNDRIP talks about, and that's what it means. And then now we need ways to actually make sure that happens. So that's important. Artists, it's not okay for other people to make films, books, plays, any forms of storytelling using our stories, because our stories are our history. So that belongs to us. That's intellectual property. So nobody has the right to do that without our permission. And ideally, our stories are always told by us, and we retain full control over any such project. So again, the parameters, how do we do that in practice? What can we start to develop to make sure that people aren't able to take these stories? I think a lot of that's going to require more cultural awareness in different funding agencies, and not just sort of the broad First Nations 101 training, but actual training that relates to specifically to the policies. So lots of training needs to be developed specifically with each department that oversees these kinds of things. Others also out from outside of our culture don't have our permission to use our words, our names, our phrases, or lyrics to name their business, to name their organization or themselves or their children. This is an infringement on our language rights. And like I said earlier on, we need to go back to the Indigenous Languages Act and make sure there are regulations so that if people are found, in a word, guilty of infringing, that there's a repercussion for it. Um, the second thing that I wanted to share about this is around students and opportunities. I believe that what we need to do is to continue to get focused around how we create opportunities for students to gain meaningful, practical, hands-on experience, knowledge, and practice. So all those summer jobs that most band offices or friendship centers or Indigenous entities can apply usually around January, February. So it's coming up. You can apply to get your summer student funding. This is a wonderful opportunity, I think, for our post-secondary coordinators or our high school coordinators, First Nations coordinators, and these federal departments and some provincial departments that supply money for student opportunities to fund our students, apply for the funding, confirm which students are going to be funded and employed, basically, so that they can have either a work placement, an internship, a co-op placement. They can be involved in curriculum-based projects, developing or testing, and they can have summer employment, also post-graduation employment. It's the best way to set up our young people for success is to make use of existing programs that create the actual employment skills-based hands-on experience that they're going to need to put on their resume and start building their career. So making use of the TRC and UNDRIP as a way to go to these funders and say, this is how we're going to do it. It makes sense with our bigger community plan around cultural preservation. That lines up really easily. I think I'm going to have to do a different workshop on grant writing. Okay, next slide, please. So, in practice, just to recap, developing our own curriculum about our own histories, we really need to do that. I think we should really have a curriculum developer, sort of a career created in our communities, and that people can network with one another. There are probably existing organizations like FNESC or FNSA, education focused organizations that could really support that. We also need to keep continuing to develop ways to teach our languages until they're part of everyday use once again. And I'm seeing that. I'm so happy. And I just offer congratulations to the communities that are having such great success. Let's also make sure that the next wave really intentionally involves artists. Okay, next slide. I've got 4 more pages of notes, but I'll save those for questions. Okay, so these last couple of calls, 67 and 94. 67 speaks to museum review. I promised I would say a few more things about that. So one of the things that I want to say quickly is access to museum collections is imperative. We're seeing a lot better policies come out of the museums around Canada, but removing barriers to access, but also making funding available so that artists and other knowledge keepers, language keepers can travel from their home communities to the place where these museums are. And so things like travel, accommodation, meal per diem, and copying costs. Those, it costs money to make prints of photos or to get photos done. So there needs to be that kind of support for our artists to get into museum collections. And the reason we need that is because there are so many things I've seen myself that I didn't know existed in our culture because they're stored away in the back room of a museum and haven't seen the light of day since the time they arrived there. So it's really important that our artists get a chance to see these things, um, observe them up closely, study them, measure them, do sketches of them, whatever they like, in the first place, so that they can do what artists do, which is replicate or use that as inspiration to create new works, but also to help provide some input to the process of repatriation. Repatriation is a big, long, huge journey for any community. And in my estimation, it's like a matrix. There's so many different layers and so many different directions it can go. But let's consider all of those. Let's really make that a part of our plans. and make sure that we support artists in being involved, and arts administrators recognizing that some of this reconnaissance work has to happen. So if you're in an arts funding program and an artist is applying, say, for a travel grant to go travel and do this work, find a way to enable that to be supported. If it's a person doing a project where they're going to replicate so that it can be brought back to their community, that's also a really terrific project. I've seen projects like this funded, and I just want to see them continue to be funded. I don't want them to fall off the table because the words don't actually match a government policy, but we can change the policy. The last thing I want to say about this is around Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which should be appropriately reflected in education and public information. That's such a huge statement. Let's stop always trying to find a new word to pan-indigenize us. We went from Indian to Native to Aboriginal to First Nation. Now we're at Indigenous. And all this time, where our own people and the Canadian public at large is not hearing our real names. So we need to, I know that we're all really proud to say our names, to say where we're from, and use those place names. I just encourage people to keep doing that and to insist on it. The whole reason why these words keep coming about is because I think there's a feeling out there in Canada in general that it's too hard to pronounce. I can't say those sounds. They can be pronounced. We can learn English, people can learn how to say our proper names and our proper place names. So I just really encourage people to do that and use the TRC and UNDRIP as ways to say, look, both of these huge documents and the Royal Commission that took place over 40 years ago all have been saying the same thing for decades. Why don't we start trying? Okay, next slide. So, in practice, continue developing your own curriculum about our histories. The only way we're going to get that right is if we do it. Continue to develop ways to teach our languages till they're part of everyday use, not saying anything that anyone hasn't said already there. And then continue to use the original names of our nations, our geographic places, and our individual names. It's happening, and I just really want to encourage people to continue to do that. Um, and then using those things like the manifestos and the declarations written in our language and then translated to English if people want to help shift the way policies are written. Next slide. I think we're getting close to the end now. All right, so in Article 16 of UNDRIP and the call to action number 14. Call to action 14 again is the Languages Act, and this goes hand in hand with the UNDRIP Article 16, which is our right to establish our own media in our own languages and to have access to all forms of non-Indigenous media without discrimination. I think this really speaks to some of the backlash we get when we do music, contemporary film, when we do things like animation. There's still this, what do they call it? Noble savage frozen in time. We are here. We're born in this era, we're modern people, and we do have traditions that go back to the beginning of time, but we also have adapted as we've gone along and accepting and embracing whatever modern tools or materials or technologies are available to us should be encouraged. Nobody should be saying that's not very traditional. We should be encouraging each other. That's what it's all about. And we think about the story I love the most I've heard from many of my fellow artists is our old people really embraced technology. When they learned how to use a reel-to-reel recorder, they embraced that and they made use of it. And thanks to their knowledge and willingness to try out new technologies, we now have recordings that have brought our songs back into our potlatches and other ceremonies. So let's not be afraid of those things. Of course, we want to make sure that it protects the intellectual property that's contained on these audio or film or any other systems. But let's make sure that we use them wisely, but let's use them. It's going to be really important for all of our grandchildren from this point onwards to be able to learn directly from us, especially since we're all not in such close proximity to one another. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so in practice. Oh my goodness, my I hope you didn't hear that big ping. So, my notes here are about just talking about how important it is for Canadian heritage and in BC, the Ministry of Tourism, Arts, Culture, and Sport to set aside specific funding and any other useful resources that will enable our people to restore everything that was intentionally taken away. And that was through these acts of legislation or Indian Act and other legislation, and really practices of genocide. Existing programs need to remove all forms of systemic and attitudinal barriers, including the stereotypes and biased opinions that are really baked into, I think, the consciousness of people who aren't from our cultures. So there's a lot of personal work to be done here in order for things like legislation to regulations to policy practice and everyday programs. In order for all of that to happen, I think we all have to take a look inside ourselves, whether you're a non-Indigenous arts administrator or an administrator of any sort, and as an artist working in the community. People don't generally understand your specific community and how things are done. And that's why I'm always encouraging communities to make smaller groups, get together, try to figure out a way that you can take control and oversee and manage all of the things that are your responsibilities. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm going to wrap this up as quickly as I can because I feel some questions coming on. Okay, so in summary, things like developing or reestablishing our own nation and community-based organizations. And when I talk about organizations, some of my favorites are the nonprofit. There are for-profit social enterprises. So a nonprofit doesn't mean you can't make a profit. It just means the board of directors can't spend it on themselves. So understanding how a nonprofit works is important. Co-ops um, and community groups that aren't registered as societies but are formally groups. You can still get funding even if you're not a registered nonprofit society. So take a look at that. Take a look at our organizations and the curriculum design that we create and we deliver in the way we teach. That's the way it makes sense. So owning that and not feeling hesitant about doing that. Take a look at declarations and manifestos. Google that when we're done here today and see if you can see samples from the arts world. There's some great inspiration around what we can say as artists and creatives that will spark some of that policy change we need to see. Statements of nationhood, I think that's sort of up there with a declaration. Um, we should practice that. Try it out a couple of times. Get our young people doing this in school as an exercise. Be a fun workshop to do within a school. And just get people practicing doing that. In the absence of that, means that we're just accepting everything the way it is around us. And us artists never do that. Uh, Also, finally, to take a look at legislative amendments. So for our political layers in our communities, take a look at what kinds of amendments can be made to address not only the shortfalls of Canadian legislation, but how we can either replace or amend it sufficiently that it actually makes sense to every single particular nation across this country. It's a huge task, but not impossible if we get started right away. Okay, next slide. Just got 2 more slides. Getting organized. So here we go again. Getting those local organizations started with a clear constitution so that your intention is very clear. Ensure the organization's bylaws function in a manner consistent with the nation's traditions, philosophies, values, and vision. So that's also some fairly new work that's happening these days. Develop ways of maintaining and sustaining that align with those traditions, philosophies, values, and visions. So how can we also be very environmentally friendly and sustainable in the long term, like really practicing what we preach when it comes to running our new organizations, and then involving the citizens of our respective nations so we can draw from their individual, collective knowledge and experiences. Um, there's always been an approach of government department decides they're going to consult. They don't like using the word consult. Engage. They're going to engage with community about something. What we have to do in our communities is make sure that as many people as possible get to be part of those processes. Even if we think, well, so and so doesn't really involve themselves in the arts, ask them. Ask them because they may be carrying knowledge and not realize how important something they learned from a grandparent or an auntie and uncle. Um, they might be waiting to carry that forward. So let's not lose opportunities. Let's make sure that we include as many people as possible, which often means one session isn't going to do it. And this leads me back to that's why if we organize ourselves locally and just provide for those opportunities for ideas to be shared and solutions to be developed, we're going to be in better shape than we would be if we just sat and waited for government to say, here's a sample of what we think you should be doing, sign off on it or not. Okay, last slide. So, in conclusion, what I'm suggesting is, and I do have some of these, that we do need to develop and share practical models of organizations. I have been sort of mapping this out in all my spare time, models that I think that would work. My favorite is the co-op model. We need also samples of organizational policies and processes. I'm also very happy to be working on that with a local nonprofit, and I've been doing this for about 40 years, just trying to get to the plain English version of how you set up your policies and processes for your nonprofit. What's also, I think, helpful would be to have some templates for developing statements of nationhood or manifestos or declarations. I've got a couple of those in the works right now. I just use myself as an example, and I, create my own little nation. So I'll be happy to share those when they come about. And then finally, processes that involve our people in any amendments to legislation, policies, programs, and processes. We're seeing things that are happening with that, the BC DRIPA Act, the Federal Declaration Act as well. We've got things like the Heritage Conservation Act. We've got museum repatriation. I know that there are a lot of engagement kinds of sessions going on out there. And I know that we're all tired of being consulted and engaged with, if that's a proper term. But I think that they are important, and more we just have to be willing to, if we get tired as individuals of doing this kind of work, make sure you have somebody stepping in to do it, because the absence of our input often means that somebody else makes the decisions for us. So in practice, being involved, you just can't replace that. It's all great wisdom, it's great knowledge and experience that every one of you have to share. And sometimes the craziest ideas end up becoming the very best policies. So I look forward to some questions. I hope you have some questions for me. And what I'm going to do is just pause for a second, see if we have any. And I've got, I think, 3 questions that came in advance of the webinar that I'll go to those if nobody else has questions. Thank you. Kayla Kesla.
Luann, there are a lot of good words for you in the chat, people thanking you. I know that this has been a really great education for me today as an artist and as someone who's also an arts administrator. I really appreciate all your knowledge that you're sharing so generously with us today. Do you have anything else that you want to say before we wrap things up today?
I just again thank everybody for coming. I'm so sorry about having to talk so fast and jam so much into an hour. There are things that I don't think I did enough justice to, but I think that just putting it out there, saying some words about it, and letting you know that I'm open to having any of these discussions. I'm on social media, Instagram and Facebook, if you want to track me down that way, or through First Peoples. I would just love to continue these discussions in our communities and just cheer you all on and encourage you to take some of these ideas, make use of them. Like I say, I'm just going to tidy up my slideshow. I'll make a PDF version. I'll send it to First People so that they can share it with you if you want my slides. And the citation, of course, is down on every slide. Leila Kesla, thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Luann.